Depot, and he went ahead and finished his paper, and this is what came out of it. He's here to talk about Battery M, which I can understand had a lot of people from Wilson that served in that unit. As a lifelong Niagara County resident, he's born and raised in Lockport, and you live in Bransonville right now, a Vietnam veteran. And with that, I'll let Ed take over.
My biggest concern coming here tonight was really my concern that you people probably family members probably know more about Battery M than I do, or at least the segments of what their lives were like, or their relatives that were in the unit. So they would probably you would have much more greater depth in some of that than I do. All I have is did the research and, on the unit itself. And the way I ended up getting there is that I went to Gettysburg 2 years ago. It's the first time I'd been there. And I was walking around seeing all these monuments. There's like 1,300 monuments there. And I'm walking around and I said, God, it's just unbelievable, you know, reading the different markers and everything else. Well, I came home and I ran into a friend of mine in a coffee shop one day. We sat down, and he loves history probably as much as I do, and has read extensively and such. And he's made many, many trips to Gettysburg. And he said to me, he says, well, did you find the monument that says Lockport, New York on it? I said, what? He said, Lockport, New York? He said, yeah. And he said to me, he said, well, you're a big college guy. You can go and research this, you know, because I kept asking all these questions. So I did. And about a month later, I came back and I says, I found it. It's Battery M. And this is the monument, and this is his picture, taken about 1985, showing that it was from Lockport, New York. And from that, I actually had sent my daughter went down, and she said, well, what was pretty interesting? I said, well, you got to find that battery, that monument that says Lockport, New York. So I got online, did a little research, and told her how to get to see the monument. That day that she went out, and she had my granddaughter with her, and she gave me this text message that wasn't very pleasant because they were trapping behind all these woods, and it was pretty thick with underbrush or underbrush, whichever you want to say, and had difficulty getting to us. So I found more recent pictures. In fact, here in the society, you have some more recent pictures, and I began to take up an interest on why this monument hadn't been taken care of. Part of what my paper was about was to do a little research on the unit itself, mainly because it was from Niagara County, and finding out more about it. And my secondary issue was that I started to look into looking at having the monument taken care of, cleaned up around it and such. And as a project maybe in the future, maybe, I would get involved in maybe raising some local funds to be able to do this, to have this cleaned up and taken care of. Now, when I was doing the initial research into it, I was amazed at how many were coming from the Wilson area. And I kept hearing about from Wilson, you know, this one and everything else. And then I came across that there was an artillery unit from the New York State Militia that was organized prior to the Civil War. It actually was part of the state militia. And if you know, prior to the Civil War, the militias were extremely powerful. And they were a very intricate part of our history, Lexington and such. That unit was the 66th Artillery Unit. It was part of it was located right here in Wilson. And on certain once a month or whenever they got together, they used to target practice right here Artillery Hill. And that's where they used to do it. Now, it's off by the Glenwood Cemetery. Now, I'm not exactly specifically known on there, but I've had people go out there and told me where they've known about that. And they also told me that they found Greenwood, yes. They find pieces of artillery shells out there. We all know Dudley. And Dudley is on the investigation trying to find me some pieces of that. But anyways, God only knows what he might bring back. But anyways, that was the beginning of the curiosity of the 66. 66, though, disbanded. And basically, as the war broke out, Lincoln called for 75,000 troops. Now, one thing that you have to understand is that during the Civil War, or at that time, when Lincoln made that statement, he only had authorization to ask for a 3-month enlistment. And sometimes you could hear people who make reference to they only enlisted for 3 months and then they got stuck for 3 years. Well, really, he was only limited to 3 months. Most of the men that did enlist in the Union Army at that time really were signing up for 3 years. The 3 months was gone, they didn't even leave home most of the time before that 3-month time was up. So it really ended up being a 3-year commitment to go fight. Now, the M Battery was being formed by a guy by the name of George Cochran. He was an attorney in Lockport. And because he was doing the organization of the unit itself, which at that particular time they weren't even sure it was going to be an artillery unit, it wasn't even designed, it was just putting together a company, and then they decided what they would become later. It wouldn't be until they got down into Albany where they would really find out what they were going to be. And I would assume, because of the strength of the ones that were in the 66th, all of a sudden it would be a matter of formality to make them an artillery unit, because they already had some kind of training and background in it. William Holmes writes in his book, or in the official record, that it's kind of a question mark that they would be an artillery unit. And whether it be, or whether he kind of makes this comment that maybe they'd be something else. I think it's almost like I had this feeling he wanted to be something else, or he wanted the unit to be something else, and that's a writer's privilege, I guess, when he can make up a little bit of his own sentiments about it. But anyways, it was basically formed up by October of 1861. There was 151 members to the unit. They came from all over, not only Wilson, Lockport, Porter, Somerset, Newfane, Hopkett, and all around Lockport. And also a certain amount came from Medina and the Shelby area. And the reason I bring that up is the first lieutenant, there was a captain who would be George Cochran, who, because he organized it, he got the rank of captain. Nothing else more than that. It wasn't that he had any kind of military experience or anything like that. It was more, he was a politician and he got that rank. And a lot of officers during that time period were voted in. So he was the most central person, and he had the ability to go and bring up these people to join. There was a Wingard, was from Medina, Shelby area, and Wingard actually was the first lieutenant, which would be the first person after Cochran in command. Now, in the initial 151 men that enlisted, 40 of them, which represents 27% of that unit in the initial enlistment, would came from the Wilson area, or that I can definitely say they came from Wilson. And one of the problems is that there was later after the beginning, there was enlistments, and they enlisted as Lockport, but you didn't know exactly where they lived. Some we did, some we don't. Later, there was actually a recruiting officer that came in, they set up an office right here in Wilson for a short period of time during the war. And that was about 1860, late 1862 going into 1863 or 64 because of the enlistments were going to be going up. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Of the original officers, there was 2 that came out of the Wilson area. Of the original, now there was 5 officers that went. Got the captain, the first lieutenant, and then there was a lieutenant for every 2 sections of guns. And that would be later, so that would be 3 second lieutenants that would be there. That was about October 14th, 1861. They left here, they went to Rochester. They stayed in Rochester for a short period of time. They moved from there down to Albany. From Albany, they went down to Washington, and that was about December of 1861, going into 1862. And that's where they got their initial training, and that's where they became officially, well, in Albany, they officially became an artillery unit. When they got to Washington, that's where they were outfitted with 6 guns. 6 guns were parallel guns. They were 10-pounders. I think I say in the next is 20-pounders, but they're really 10. And that's one of the guns right there. For the picture of them. That was a light gun, but they considered a light gun because it was only, there was 10-pounders. Heavier guns, like the New York Heavy, they weren't transported or anything like that. Heavier would be almost when they go into what they call the Napoleon, which was a brass gun, and that was a 20-pound gun, which is a little bit heavier. These were rifled barrels, and they were extremely accurate, which becomes important later on. They were outfitted in Washington, and for every 2 guns, there was a section, there'd be a second lieutenant who would look over each one of those 2 guns, making a total of 6 guns. And I was going to do a slide on the whole breakdown of everything else, but in the unit, the unit would travel not only with the gunners and the people then on the horses. There would be 6 horses to each one of the guns, which made horses very important. They carried a wagon that did nothing but blacksmithing and also farrieing to take care of the horses. They were just as much a part of the unit as the men. So that was an integral part. There was also the first sergeant, who actually came out of Wilson, and quartermaster sergeant, who also came from Wilson, a guy by the name of Reuben Wilson Oliver. And just as a end note, of the 151, that did not include the officers. They were counted separately. Officers always ride in a different kind of category. In the early 1862, they went into battle and went over into the peninsula in Winchester. Now this is a list of some of the battles that they were in as a unit. And I saw a listing today. There's probably 3 times as many battles as that they were in. And these were just basically the major ones. And you can see some of the most famous being Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. And they distinguished themselves in all three of those major battles, the big battles. They also distinguished themselves all the way through. And I'm going to kind of jump over, I'm not going to go through every battle and try to get all that way. Some people really are bored. What I'm going to try and do is skip over and tie you up and get down to Antietam, which was a significant battle, and that was a day that they have, Antietam was a battle, in some way should have ended all battles. That was that one given day of that battle, more men were killed than ever before in all the rest of the Civil War. 23,000 were killed in the one day. It was horrific. Battery M, on the first day of it, was involved over what they call the West Woods. And they actually held off a Confederate infantry unit, whole regiment actually, by themselves, just by what is called canister shot. Canister shot is just what it is. It's shaped just like a can. And in that can is all kinds of ball bearings. Back then it would have been nails. It would have been any kind of scrap metal, small fragmentation of anything packed into this can. It would be rammed with it. It would be a charge put behind it, and then it would be rammed into it. And then the gun would be, instead of being like this, it would be lowered down to a level position like this and fired out. And once it goes out, it just goes like that. And the whole idea in the military, a wound is just as good as a kill. You've taken that person out of the battle. The more he's wounded, the better it is, because once he's wounded, you got to have other people take care of him. During this time period, they just left him. Nothing was taken care of until after the battle was over, and that was even questionable. And the only ones who would needed help in were guys that were in the battle itself and trying to help their buddies. Most times, actually, for just kind of a reference, it wasn't until the first time they started actually taking bodies off the battlefield was the War of 1812. Prior to that, during the Revolutionary War, if you didn't have a relative or a friend take you off the battlefield, or you weren't an officer, you weren't an officer, you were left on the battlefield to rot. And that's why a lot of times they were called boneyards. Saratoga, and during from this Revolutionary War, the battle there's still bones coming up that they still find. That would also happen in the Civil War in many places like the Wilderness, that actually they went through a couple times through. That was also true. There were just so many casualties, they couldn't get them off the battlefield. But they were taken care of. They weren't buried. If they were buried, it was very shallow grave. And a lot of times, a good rainstorm, and would take all the soil away, so they were just left on the field. Anyways, they distinguished themselves extremely well. They held off, like I said, a Confederate charge for 2 days. They were in that area. The battle shifted, and actually the battle was broken up into 3 different things, 3 different segments that went on during that day. They were relieved, and the units were pulled out. They were moved around and such. Believe it or not, General McCollum, if he was a better general, if it had been Grant, could have won that battle. If they had won that battle that day, the Civil War would have been over, and that was in 1862. Thank you. From Antietam, they would go on a march, and they would end up in Chancellorsville. And that began into the spring of 1863. They recouped a lot of times the troops. Well, actually, McCollum pulled them back out, and they went back up into New York City, out the peninsula, went back up into Washington. I'm sorry, not New York City. Went back into Washington. Then they came back across, made another advance across, actually in Winchester, Virginia. That was taken and given 4 times, I believe it was, during the Civil War. It was taken, it was abandoned, it was taken, it was abandoned, and went out. And anyways, in the spring, they came out with another campaign. Chancellorsville ended up being about a month before Gettysburg. Yeah. About a month and a half, 2 months before Gettysburg. Chancellorsville, the unit lost 2 of its guns. They were knocked out. They were knocked out, not from gunfire, really, believe it or not. They were actually in a hurry to change positions, because that battle kind of was a flux. It was just moving all over the place. Anyways, and they were in such a hurry to move, the guns actually rolled off the back of the carriages and ran down the hill and broke all the hell. Up until that time, I said there was 151. When the Chancellorsville battle was over, they lost 2 men, I believe, at Chancellorsville, killed. The unit had dropped down to, when they left and entered into Gettysburg, the unit went down to 97 men. So that was 54 guys that had just been eliminated. In the opposite corps, if you go to Antietam today, you look up on the monument, and it's got all the units that were there. Now, they don't have as many monuments as they do at Gettysburg, but on there for the New York State, you see listed Battery M. And you see George Cochran's name, the captain. Well, unfortunately, and this goes to a little story, George Cochran was actually out of the field. He wasn't there at Antietam. He was brought up on charges. He was charged with 15 different violations. What specifically, I'm not sure, but I think it had to do with commissioning goods that he was not supposed to be dealing with or selling or doing something of that nature. He was actually convicted of 11 of those charges. He was found guilty. At the time, they pulled him away, pulled him off the, stripped him his rank and his leadership. But all through the Civil War, there was many cases of corruption, there was many cases of desertion, there was many types of things like this. There was a lot that were caught, a lot of soldiers were caught trying to leave the battlefield and brought up on charges. Lincoln would reverse that on a regular basis. And in fact, I just finished reading a book on him, and I think that in there, if I'm not mistaken, there was only 2 instances that he allowed the charges to stand. He basically reversed all of those, and that's what happened to George Cochran. George Cochran came back, and it wasn't until after Gettysburg that he actually showed up. And one of the things that I bring this up because the guy that was leading the unit at that time was Wingard from Shelby. He was the first lieutenant, and he was actually the one that was directing the unit. Sometime in between these 2 battles, he picked up. But he was there, he was in charge of them, in Antietam, Chancellorsville, and in Gettysburg. I'm going to leave Cochran alone for a little bit because he did come back, and we'll go on to Gettysburg a little bit, and I'll tell you the story of Gettysburg. Now, as I said earlier, just a little while ago, when they arrived in Gettysburg, they arrived on the first day, July 1st. But they were depleted. They had lost 2 guns, so they moved them, and they were taken down to Palmer's Hill. And Palmer's Hill, they were set up there with the other 4 guns, and that's where they were staying in almost as a reserve type of situation. And they were just to hold back and support supply artillery. Now, they would, for an artillery unit, you wouldn't go for a canister. What they would do is be a support, and that doesn't mean they weren't firing, because they would fire. Because these guns would have a range up, could go up to a mile. So they would elevate it, and they would take on fire, and they would be a support fire in support of the infantry or whatever battle was going on that they could possibly see. And they were there the first, second, and the third day. On the, I believe it was the second day of January or July 2nd, the 27th Indiana Infantry Unit got pinned down by snipers. And they were pinned down pretty bad. And the snipers were taking them out, and they were lodged in a house just past, well, where, I don't know if everybody knows the battlefield that well, but anyways, it was a distance away. I guess that's the best way to describe it. They were a distance away, and they weren't getting any help. Battery Adams, or Wingard, ordered one of his guns to come down off the hill and move over in a position where they could get a shot at it. And actually I brought a sort of a map, and I'll hand it around. And you'll see down the bottom, this is where Battery M is, and this is where the 27th Infantry, or Indiana was. With about 4 rounds, they knocked that whole house down. Took care of all the snipers, and even in records of the that I've come across with Indiana, the 27th Indiana, they were extremely happy or glad that the battery was able to help them out. And that was about the only thing that they really did in Gettysburg that was any kind of major. They weren't on the hill with, you know, for Pickett's charge or anything like that, but they were a definite part of the battle, and they did do a support role, and they helped. From here, they would leave. They kind of chased after Lee, but they didn't. Potomac, the Army of the Potomac went after them. They didn't. They kind of left Lee alone for a day. I mean, that was crazy. No, it just seemed like they should have gone after him right then and there. And if they had pressed him at that day on the 4th, they probably would have been into war again right then and there and knocked Lee out. But they didn't. So the next couple of months, the unit was taken into Washington, and it was basically put into rest. And at this time is exactly when they started calling for more people to come in. And that's when the unit started to increase, and it was coming from here. That's when they started setting up a recruiting office, and there were more guys, and I didn't do the exact count, that would come out of the Wilson area and the Lockport area and join the unit. Very few men were left, were not from here. There was an occasional guy from Watertown and some from Elmira and different spots like that, but the bulk all still came from Niagara County. There's another story that goes on with Antietam. There's an officer by the name of Woodbury. Woodbury got shot, believe it or not in the leg or anything else, on his spine. He got shot in the saddle. The saddle took a round. Believe it or not, the family held on to that until about, I think it was about 1989. Held on to that saddle. And they did something very special. They took it back to Antietam and turned it over to the federal government, and it's now part of the archives of the battlefield of Antietam, which I kind of thought was really cool. I think that's really something. So if you're ever on a trip, you got to ask to see the saddle. So, anyways, the unit, because it was being kind of reinforced, left out of Washington, and then they kind of went to about 3 different places, one in Tennessee, and then into 2 places in Tennessee, and then they went into, I believe it was Bridgeport, Alabama, and they took and wintered there in that location. And also, instead of getting new guns and staying with Parrott gun, they actually got new 20-pound Napoleon all brass guns, and they got those, and they were building up, this was all being built up to the march towards Atlanta. All of these battles, this, all took place within about a 3-month period in the summer, basically in the summer of 1864. They were all on a march heading towards Atlanta. And what they were trying to do, Sherman was trying to encircle and cut off all the rail lines, every supply line they could, not only into Atlanta, but also anything going into Richmond, because Richmond was pretty getting close to when they were going to go into siege. But they stayed there, and finally got there in mid-August. From mid-August until September 8th, 1864, they were a part of taking Atlanta. And that's where the famous story about Lorenzo Pratt getting the horse Billy Sherman. That's where he got it. It was in one of these battles, and I think it was Peachtree Creek, is where that horse he found. Billy Sherman, as you all know, he kept the horse, brought it back to Wilson, and it's buried here today, 1881 or something like that. Right out in the Wilson-Burt line, or Wilson-Burt Road. And that's where he picked it up. Now, Lorenzo Pratt, does anybody know what he did when he was in service? No? You're not supposed to talk. Anyways, he was a bugler. He was a bugler in the unit. They had like 3 of them that were part of the unit, believe it or not. And that was part of the thing. So he definitely needed a horse. And one of the good things you read is you read about some of the accounts of some of the guys that were in there, especially coming from like some of the writings from Ira Pettit and stuff. There's sort of this thing that goes on. One of the best things of being in the artillery was you rode. You didn't walk. And you could hear it. You think about how many miles. I mean, you're talking thousands of miles. As infantry, you would have been walking the whole time. These guys were riding. The 6 horses, there were 3 pairs of horses. There was always a person on top of them. There was guys that were on the carriages, on the gun carriages and stuff. Nobody walked. There was extra wagons carrying ammunition, There was what you'd call a chuck wagon type thing where you had food and supplies. And like I said, they had a moving blacksmith shop that went along with them. So these guys were always moving, and they're always riding. They never walked. After they took Atlanta, and they stayed there for a very, very short period of time, no more than about a month. And that's when the unit became part of Sherman's march to the sea. Now, going back a little bit, I mentioned a guy by the name of Reuben Wilson Oliver, who was a quartermaster. And he tells a story, he wrote an article in the Lockport Journal about how this unit became known as the Cochrane Bummers. Now, a bummer was somebody that foraged food or went after different things. And there's different connotations as you go through some of the annals of the war. All he talked about was he would go after poultry, chickens. You got to remember, they were eating hardtack most of the time. very rare, and if anything, they would get salted pork, and that would be about the only beef. So if you got a chicken, if you got a turkey, that would be even better. And every so often, they would go out and they would scrounge in the farms and stuff, and they would come back in. And whenever they got asked how they got that bird, the comment was made to the officers was, Mrs. Lincoln sent it to us. And that was used many, many times. And there are references that on 2 different occasions, they had turkeys, and there was a general that was kind of riding by, and he saw the soldier with these turkeys, and asked him about the turkeys, and he responded with, Mrs. Lincoln sent them to us. And he said, really? He said, well, Mrs. Lincoln is going to send one to me now. And they ended up, 2 of them ended up going to the general's table, and for their staff, they have food. Now, as you get into the march to the sea with Sherman, this becomes pretty big, because right now the war had gone into a state, almost a stalemate. There was, Grant was stuck outside of Richmond, and they were having a hell of a time trying to take Richmond. It was almost becoming a stalemate. So the only way that they stopped in 1863, or 64, was first they stopped prisoner exchanges, which meant that they were going to start taking prisoners and holding them, and that's when Anderson started to become big, and same with Elmira. Is the winter of the war, Elmira is not talked about, Andersonville is talked about, but they were about equal. None of the prisoner of war camps were very good, none of them. And they're almost as equal in savagery, in the sense of people dying, soldiers dying within it. They were undermanned, understaffed, and the whole 9 yards of it. But anyways, the idea was, why give back? The North felt that they had enough men coming back in and replenishing their troops that they would be able to continue the fight and continue to be able to withstand or continue to have more men available to them. The South, it was becoming very critical by now. The Mississippi was cut off, the blockades were almost working, or were pretty well working, and the Confederacy was starting to starve to death. So when they started the march down through to Savannah, Sherman's idea was total war as you eliminate everything. And for about a 50-mile stretch, they did. They took care of all the barns, farms, villages, towns, everything. Destroyed them all. And they marched down there, and they made it in about a week, about a month and a half, 2 months. Once they got there, they stayed there for about a month, and then they turned out, and they started back up into South Carolina and into North Carolina. And that was well into 1865. They were in these last 2 battles, both of these were in the Carolinas. And the unit ended up being in, when the war broke, or finished, they ended up going into Washington, D.C., and becoming a part of the Grand Review, which was the huge, they went on for a week, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Everybody thinks it was a one-day event, but it was like a week it went on, because there were so many units were all brought in, and they were all marching on the Army of the Potomac. Sheridan was out still looking for Johnson, but then they finally captured him, and they had them taken care of. They came up and they marched to the review also. So, and then from there, they came back to Rochester, and in Rochester they were mustered out. And before I leave right there, I'm going back to George Cochran. George Cochran did get charged with with additional charges for corruption or whatever. But shortly after that, as he was in the court martial proceedings, he ended up getting sciatica, which means he couldn't ride anymore. So he basically resigned, and that was in 1863, late 63, November of 63. Don't hold me to all these dates, but it's pretty close to that. Anyways, he resigned, and that's when Wingard took over and he became a captain. They made him captain. But shortly after that, he was sent out, and he was moved to another unit. One of the things that would happen in the military at that time was if you became a captain, or became in charge, there was one thing, and there's a couple of the guys in here, we're going to get into some of the numbers, that went from a private all the way up to being first lieutenant. And one, I think, became a captain, but he was also moved to reassigned to a different unit, because they had too much friendship where they looked at it. This is the numbers, and we know about the first numbers here. In total, 262 men through the course of the war would be a part of the unit. 12 would be killed in battle, that we know of. 20 would be die from disease, which really occurred in the first year of the war. The Sanitation Commission came into existence, and they started changing how they set up latrines. Most of that was dysentery and diarrhea and such as that. 2 would be transferred to the Navy, believe it or not. 14 would be mustered out to that they expired their time, which means that they served their 3 years. Which is interesting is this unit. Now, I told you back that the unit had dropped down to 97 men, and a few more would be lost, but out of the remaining ones in the original, 62 of them would re-enlist in 1863. Their term, or 1864, their term was up, and they would re-enlist and stay with the unit until the end. I'm going to say 15 deserted. We have somebody that was listed as deserted, but she has proven to me, at least I believe, that a relative of hers was listed as deserted. But they found him. He was actually in a hospital in Washington, D.C. He had pneumonia, which a lot of times the accuracy of records is very difficult. Sometimes you get these numbers and you're constantly saying, well, this doesn't add up and this doesn't add up. So you're constantly working. But the records are very, very difficult for not only the Union Army, it's almost impossible for the Confederate Army. The Confederate Army, when they went into Richmond and they finally took Richmond, everything was burned. And all those records of what happened to a lot of those units is gone. And you look and you can just see, in many of the books I look at, you'll see the units and stuff, casualty rates were just all over the place. So one of the things what also happens too, when it happens, they'll talk about killed, wounded, and missing. Soldiers at this time, they had no dog tags around them. Most of the time in the infantry, they would write their name on a piece of paper and pin it to the back of their shirt or their jackets when they went into battle. Or they would try and write it someplace. That's because when they went down, sometimes they were so mutilated, nobody could identify them. So they would try and do something like that, so hopefully that they would be recognized and they would be, so that their loved ones would know. Many, many cases, thousands of them, they were mutilated beyond being able to tell what they looked like. This is the officers. This is a breakdown of the officers. A total of 13 would be assigned to the unit. 5 of them would resign. As an officer, your commission, and you can accept the commission, and then all of a sudden, if you just don't like it, you basically resign, and you left. One would be promoted and transferred, actually, I think there's two. Two sergeants would receive commissions and be reassigned to other units, and one officer would be discharged. And I believe, they don't specifically say, but that's Concord. He would later absolve himself of all these charges and everything else to clear his name. He would get a pension later on, and he would get a pension from for the sciatica, whatever. Then this famous picture. This is, I don't believe this was taken at I think this was at the dedication of the monument. What year? I think this was like in about 1900 or 1905 in that area. And the only reason I do is Holmes. Holmes looks like getting a little old. And I believe he was 22 when he went in and enlisted. So give him the 4 years, and that's 25, and then add another 35, that puts him about 60 years old. And I do know that the monument was not one of the first. It wasn't until about 1881 that they really started getting fired up about starting putting up monuments and such on the battlefield and remembering it. And that's it. You have any questions? Any questions?
Those dreadful
Canister rounds?
yeah, who made those?
Munitions people. There was probably,
There were
thousands
thousands.
of them. Probably hundreds of thousands of them.
And it-
That was the main use of artillery versus, the concept of lobbing it in and blowing them up in the back canister rounds.
That goes back to even the Mexican War, they used that type of thing.
Actually,
It's actually like taking a cannon and making a shotgun out of it.
exactly, but it even goes back further than that. It used in the American Revolution too.
But there's a famous quote, Civil War General Braxton Bragg, and during the Mexican War, there's a quote.
Yes.
Give them grape. Give them grape mean a grape shot. Look at the size of the grape, with the little pellets were in it.
And there was a canister round which was smaller, that you had, was like a little bit bigger than a BB round or whatever. And then there was the grape round, which was a little bit heavier. In other words, that was different. The other one was they would break two cannonballs, and they would basically affix a chain to it. And the chain would fire out, and the balls would just come out like this, and they'd just catch people with whatever side. The first time actually in the Civil War was about the first time canister rounds. And one of the things that in the Civil War, or the Revolutionary War, was to get the cannon like this. What they wanted to do was not to have it go straight. They wanted it to start bouncing. Bouncing, and it picked up speed, and it bounced in, and immediately. War is hell.
Where does the M come from the meat?
The M comes from, as a regiment, there's 10 companies in a regiment, okay? In an infantry company, or an infantry regiment, it would be called a company. In an artillery unit, they would be batteries. So it starts with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, all the way through F. And that's where the M comes from. And they would break off as an artillery unit. You can see that their casualty rates were extremely low. Now, in the infantry units, there would be units that would be completely annihilated, and they would be remade. So they would, I think there was the first New York Light Artillery. was the 8th Heavy coming out of Lockport. But basically, that was it for most of the artillery, because they didn't have casualties. And the difference being with the infantry, they went from the first infantry, all the way on through to 156th Regiment. And they kept adding regiments because of the deaths and things like that. Infantry had much more heavier losses as they went down through. No, that's not the first. That's the first infantry division, mind you, in Vietnam. Anyone else?
Could I do a 1-minute introduction for myself?
Sure. I guess. I'm not the program director.
All right. I'd like to introduce myself. I don't know if some of you may know me, but I used to live here in Wilson, New York. Since then, I've moved up around Buffalo, Lancaster, Kew area. But I have become a Abraham Lincoln presenter. I'm one of 186 in my group of Lincoln presenters. I've been on the Today Show, American Heritage Magazine, Reader's Digest, all kinds of things, all kinds of programs around town doing historical events and such. But what I'm going to show you here is October 4th and 5th, I've gone to Hodgenville, Kentucky, which is the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. And I went there and I entered 2 contests, one for the Abraham Lincoln lookalike contest and one for the oratory contest. I came in first on the oratory contest and I came in second on the lookalike, you know. But anyway, here's my picture there. This is in Hodgenville, Kentucky, the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. So I just want to share that with you, and sometime I may come down here and do a program. So if you get into that, you want to hear the program, I'll bring General Grant with me. There is a lot of good things going on.
We want Sherman.
You should see the Grant bill that's going to be playing the part for, they're going to redo Appomattox. They're having a General Grant, a General Lee, and I guess probably Fritz Klein from Springfield, Illinois is going to be the Abraham Lincoln. Of course, Lincoln was never at Appomattox, but they're going to do a program in several times for Appomattox, and it's going to make national news. It's through the Parks Commission and stuff, so it's going to be phenomenal. It'll start on, I believe, April 8th and run right through till like the 20th or whatever. It's going to be fantastic.
It's the 150th anniversary.
The 150th anniversary of the signing of Appomattox. And the person that's going to be there also will be Al Parker. Al Parker is someone who I know from the groups here. I belong to several Civil War groups in the area in Buffalo. But anyway, Al Parker is related to Ely Parker, who wrote the terms for the settlement of the Civil War between the North and the South.
Didn't you?
Yeah.
Native American. Native American.
Right, yeah, Native American out of Tonawanda area. Small world, and I worked 40 years at General Motors on Delavan, and I actually worked with his brother, Bernie Parker, who's since passed away, though. Al Parker. He just had his, see this picture here, this sells at the art shows for $5, you know. Same thing as a $5 bill, and you get a $4.80 rebate, you know. He had his picture done. Al Parker had his picture painted, and it's for sale for $8,000, you know, so $5, $8,000. All right, thank you.
Now I have, I left with, here at the Society a copy of this. This here is a breakdown of the entire unit. It's all the names of who enlisted and enlisted men. And then there's a list here also of all the officers. And I'm sure that you're all going to want to know whether your relative might be on here, and that's a very strong possibility. We already found 2 that were here. Simon Outwater, who died at Atlanta. And I've seen letters of him, references to him in, which maybe at some point I'll get you a copy of that. Some of the comments that were made in there. But this also, it has, when they went in, where they were from, or I tried to get where they were from, because where they enlisted, they enlisted not only here in Wilson, but they're in Lockport, but they also here in Wilson. Actually, Holmes enlisted in Virginia. And I think he went down to be with, I think it's his brother was also in the unit. And he went to, let me get yeah, here he is. Newmarket, Virginia. Yeah, William Homes, Newmarket, Virginia. And I don't have what age he was. He also got out in Raleigh, North Carolina. And that was because he was discharged. So he spent his 3 years. And then there was another George Albert Holmes, and I have made the assumption, this is just an assumption, this was his brother. He went in 1861.
I have George listed as a farrier.
Yeah, he's a farrier. Farrier, okay. And actually, Holmes lived right next to Pratt. That's where his homestead was, right next to where Eliza Pratt homestead is. His was right next door, and the house is still standing there today.
Shears Market is.
Hmm?
It's where Shears Market is, that house there?
Yes, exactly, that house. But this is available to you, and this also for officers, you know, you're related to Woodbury and Gomer, he's involved. These are also available if you want, and I'll be here tonight too. I promised one to somebody. Or both of them to somebody, so you can take a look, but I do have additional copies.
Can you
Yes.
email it?
Right.
Can you email that document?
Can I email it? Yeah, I can. Yeah. Two?
Well, I'll give you
Okay, yes.
I'm just curious, have you, with the GAR, how many are located in the area cemetery here in town?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I have to look on my list here with, there's quite a few battery employees.
Some from the war, any from the war of 1812?
No. We have, there's a Revolutionary War veteran, Barry Greenwood. He served in Vermont and then he moved here later on. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's anybody in 1812.
We just did a program in,
Because you gotta remember, the War of 1812, there was a lot, now, just as I said, 1812 was on that border of where they might have just been shot. There was no actual battles here, so I mean, they might have been shot to left. But a lot went back to the Fort Niagara, and there's something buried there.
Veterans possibly,
Yes.
but survived.
we just did a big program in West Falls, New York, Griffin's Mills, and the War of 1812 program was done there the other day. Anyway, the migration of people, and we are the only spot where they can actually document part of the Underground Railroad going through that creek, through the Griffin's Mills. It's part of East Aurora, it's actually West Aurora.
Actually, I think, well, the troops came down through here, they went down to, War of 1812, they went down to where the Van Horn ranch is, and they went after the Griswold down there, and they destroyed it.
Or Lewiston was burned.
Yeah, but it was in that same time period that they went for the Griswold. Griswold was more important than Lewiston. Griswold was very important, because they was around flour.
Well, we regenerated the Hull House, HULL Hull House, on Genesee Street out in Lancaster, and that's where a lot of the people fled that area of Buffalo Burn.
Any questions? Any additions?
Yeah, we were talking about the injury that got on the battlefield. Can't give you the specifics, but the local man at the police from Orange County, he went out to get Gettysburg, one of the battles, he picked up his son, he was notified his son.
That would be very big.
There's a wagon there, and while he was there, he recognizes a neighbor's son.
Dead.
So, yes, so he knows him, and his son.
That was very common. That was more common.
How long is the drive? It's me.
20 miles a day,
Yeah.
20, 25 miles a day, so it probably
Probably took him some
It would have gone probably mid-July. Yeah. Another problem.
How would they replenish their horses? That they would always, they would just take, or they would, who would supply them?
There was a regular horse traders that came really from the west, they bought the Army dog. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the number that sticks in my mind was just representation. It was 5,000 horses. 5,000 horses were killed at getting just horses. That's not.
What was the battle like?
Yeah.